Again, thank you, everyone. We are ready to get going on our second session of the day, featuring invited speaker John Villasenor, who will be introduced and moderated by our CII colleague and conference co-organizer, Bruce Pittman. I should probably say that the session will officially end at noon, not 12:15. So we'll have a full hour for lunch. Going back to Bruce. Bruce is a professor in the Department of Material Design and Innovation, author or co-author of more than 90 research articles, and principal investigator or co-investigator of approximately 15 million of research and equipment awards. An expert in mathematical modeling. For the last 2 decades, he has been studying uncertainty quantification, techniques for understanding uncertainty in models of physical or biological systems, and how computing can account for these uncertainties. Bruce has served as Vice Provost for Educational Technology, Associate Dean for Research and Sponsored Programs in the College of Arts and Sciences, and Dean of the CAS College between 2011 and 2016. Between 2019 and 2021, Bruce served as interim director of the Institute for Computational and Data Science. He will act as session respondent as well. He will be joined by Luke Bodmer, a PhD candidate in the UB Computational and Data Enabled-Sciences program. Please welcome Professor Bruce Pittman.
Good morning, everybody. So today's session, as David had suggested, is featuring John Villasenor from UCLA. John is a professor of electrical engineering, law, management, and public policy. The session will be a little different. John will give about 15, 20, 25-minute presentation. He'll then pose a question to all of us, and we'll go into discussion groups. We'll break up with a couple of tables each. After about 10 minutes of that discussion, a designated speaker from each of those groups will sort of summarize the group's answer to the question John's going to pose. That will lead to some responses from Luke and from me, and that will then open up a larger discussion with all of us. So again, let me introduce Professor John Villasenor of UCLA. In addition to his academic positions, John is co-director of the Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy at UCLA. He's a fellow at the Brookings Institute, at the Hoover Institute. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And in addition to his academic publishing, he's also written extensively in forums, public forums like the Atlantic and Forbes magazine and Scientific American, and many, many others. John's a graduate of the University of Virginia and got his PhD from Stanford University. Please join me in welcoming John Villasenor.
So hi, everybody. Really glad to have the opportunity to be here. And what I'm hoping to do is spare you the pain of listening to me for too long. This thing keeps falling down here. That's okay if it doesn't. So anyway, what we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about sort of the role of uncertainty and things like that. And so we have a 70-minute session. And I sort of broke it down. And so that's the plan. I'm going to try to frame this in a way that hopefully is maybe interesting, maybe thought-provoking. So I won't go over this again because we just went over it. But we are going to break up into groups and have some discussion. So here's a question, and I'm going to answer. I'd love to answer. Here's a hypothetical. A claim is made by a political candidate on the evening of a national election, in other words, late in that day. There was a significant amount of voter fraud today in city X. How accurate is this claim? Anyone know? And let's suppose it's let's say the claim was made 20 minutes ago, right? How accurate is this claim? No inputs. You don't know, and nobody knows, right? You can't know, right? It may be accurate, it may be inaccurate, right? And so that's, one of the challenges with, it's easy, it's easy to say, it's like I use the analogy, it's easy to say, hey, algorithms should be unbiased, but it's, can be hard to sort of agree on exactly how you define bias. It's easy to say there shouldn't be a misinformation, but it can be hard to know when there's misinformation. Now, in the end, this claim will either be true or it's not true, but if you're trying to figure it out in the moment, it's not particularly easy. So misinformation, disinformation, in this crowd, everybody knows, I'm assuming, but there's not, almost maybe not, that's, you folks are from high school, right? So for, at least for their benefit, or maybe do you know the difference between misinformation and disinformation? Okay, well, let's, somebody can tell us misinformation versus disinformation. Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's basically, false information. They're both false, right? But misinformation is not intentional. Disinformation is false information spread with intent. They can both be really problematic, right? If I'm, going to catch the next train, is there a Buffalo train station? If there's a Buffalo train, Amtrak station, and I ask somebody who is well-meaning and says, "Oh, you don't need to rush. You still have 20 more minutes," and but they're mistaken. It's actually 10 minutes, and I take 12 minutes to get to the train station. I miss the train. That's still harm, even though there was no intent. Now, that's just as much harm as if the person thought it's really going to come in 10 minutes, but I'm going to tell this person 20 just so he's going to miss the train. That would be malicious, but the harm is the same. So it can be a problem in both cases. So the European Union has been much more active on this than the United States generally in a sort of a formal regulatory standpoint. And so here's a definition from the European Union. Misinformation, false or misleading content shared without harmful intent, though the effects can still be harmful. And similarly, disinformation is false or misleading content that is spread with an intention to deceive or secure economic or political gain and can cause public harm. Okay, so, and if you highlight here, I just highlighted false, right? So if you are in an effort, an endeavor to address and combat misinformation and disinformation, by definition, you have entered the realm of trying to figure out what is true and what is false. And what I am going to try to do is sort of convey the importance of uncertainty and really a certain amount of humility as we make these sorts of judgments, because we haven't been very good at it in the recent or more distant past. So when we're evaluating whether an assertion is true, what are some sources that we can look to? Right? How do we, if there's an assertion and we're not sure if it's misinformation or if it's true, how might what are some places we could look to get information that could help us answer that question? Any thoughts? Sorry? News sites is one place that you might reasonably look. That's a perfectly reasonable place to look. It won't always be right, but it's a reasonable place to look. Where else? What are there people that we might consult? A librarian, or more generally, any other types of people that you might consult? Any ideas? Your parents? Well, if your parents know something about that, right? Right? Or if it's an assertion about medicine, maybe you'd consult a medical doctor, right? There's experts, right? But let's do an experiment. We're going to do a thought experiment. Let's suppose that the year is 1855. And let's suppose that Twitter exists in 1855. And let's suppose that you're in charge of the content moderation team. I know Twitter these days doesn't have as much of a content moderation team, but it had a pretty significant one. And let's assume that it's 1855 and there's a substantive content moderation team at Twitter. And we're going to introduce two eminent physicians at the time. On the left, we have John Snow, a physician, and among other things, he helped to advance anesthesia. And on the right, we have William Farr, an epidemiologist, and he, among other things, is a founder of the field of medical statistics. So two very eminent people. And there was it was multiple, but one of the very problematic diseases that was going around at that time was, anyone want to guess? In London? Cholera, right. And there were two competing theories of disease. Does anyone know what one of them was? Yeah. the miasma theory, and then there's the germ theory. And so this is an illustration from an 1831 lithograph showing, portraying, cholera. And this miasma theory was this idea that there are these bad vapors. You sounds like you've heard of this and know something about it. And it was widely believed to be the source of disease. So here's a constructed tweet. But the words, I mean, obviously John Snow didn't send a tweet in 1855, but he did write these words. This is an exact quote. He said, "I believe that the poison of the cholera is either swallowed in water or got directly from some other person in the family or in the room." And let's suppose that it's March 16th, 1855, and it's right now it's, early afternoon, and, a few hours ago at 10:15 a.m., he tweeted that, and it's already got 230,000 views. Now, his nemesis in this debate, William Farr, and this is a real quote from William Farr. Now, obviously, he didn't tweet it an hour or two later, but he really wrote this. "After careful inquiry, we see no reason to adopt this belief. We do not feel it established that the water was contaminated in the manner alleged." And so he sent, in our little hypothetical here, he sent this at, which should be 11:42 a.m. So he sent it, let's say an hour and a half later, and he's already up to 117,000 views. So and let's suppose it's, early afternoon, and both these tweets are up there. They're getting 100,000 views an hour. They can't both be true. I mean, one of them is clearly misinformation. You're the content moderation team at Twitter. What do you do? What do you do? I mean, this is a serious question. What do you do? Any thoughts on what you might do here? Now, we all know, of course, at the end of the story, it's John Snow was right? And William Farr was wrong. The germ theory didn't get solidly established until the late 1800s, and it was at least a couple of more years before it even gained a significant advantage in its acceptance. So what would you do? Any thoughts? Yeah. So you could ask for proof. Yeah, okay, but remember, it's a reasonable answer, but it's, there's 100,000 people an hour looking at each one of these. So would you take them down and say, would you moderate them both away? Yeah. You put a disclaimer on both. You could say, on both of them, you could say, the information suggested here is contested. There is no scientific consensus on this. And yeah, that is a reasonable way to do it. But in some sense, in hindsight, you would have been, clouding, you would have been adding doubt to something which was true at the top, right? And so you would have been undermining a true assumption or true statement, in the interest of kind of recognizing the uncertainty. And many people say, well, to address misinformation, disinformation, we can ask the experts. Well, they're both experts, right? They're both among the leading experts of the day. And so, I give this example because obviously Twitter didn't exist, but with the benefit of hindsight, we have absolute clarity on this, and it's easy, but we often it's harder to place ourselves in the moment. And although, as we'll see in a few minutes, we've had chances to do that recently and haven't done that well, but it's harder to place ourselves in the moment and recognize how hard this would be at the moment. Because again, real damage is being done, right? In this hypothetical, you have 100,000 people an hour reading William Farr, who says there's nothing to worry about with the water, right? And then some of those people will go on to get cholera. So it's obviously this particular situation doesn't exist today, but there are others. So if you think about why does misinformation, why is it out there? And people can have different taxonomies, but one way to think about it is misinformation where there's insufficient knowledge. Society is well equipped to identify whether it's true or not, given sufficient time, but that time hasn't passed yet. Go back, please, to my example at the beginning about the politician who claims on the evening of an election that there was a significant amount of fraud. That's a claim that at that moment, it may be hard to assess as true or false, but given some amount of time, it's going to be pretty easy to assess, or not necessarily easy, but it will be possible to assess it. Another source of misinformation is social context. misinformation that society simply isn't prepared to identify as misinformation due to social and political factors. And this can take years or decades or sometimes centuries to resolve. There's also, as we'll see, misinformation arising from sources with vested interests in propagating the misinformation, right? Even if perhaps they know that there's not misinformation. And you can have intersections of all of these things. So, misinformation can be present due to all these things. So let's go to a very famous example, which again, with the benefit of hindsight is clear. We're going to look at some historical examples because I think, well, I'll tell you why later, but I think giving a historical perspective is really important on this. So this is a headline from a 1992 New York Times article where, the Vatican says, after 350 years that Galileo was right. Now, of course, it's, we all think it's, we all think, well, this is ridiculous. Of course, Galileo was right. But I don't know in the 1600s how many of us would have been really confident in saying that the earth goes around the sun, right? You have on the one hand, the church, the Catholic Church telling you, no, it's the sun that goes around the earth. And then you have this one scientist who says, no, Catholic Church, you're wrong. It's the earth that goes around the sun. Galileo's assertions, those were viewed as misinformation. And it took hundreds of years to resolve those. And if you look at our potential causes, well, the reason this misinformation persisted for some number of years was there was insufficient knowledge in the general scientific community. The social context, right? The social context being that the Vatican was immensely more powerful than Galileo, and then vested interests, which is the church had a vested interest in not having its authority undermined by somebody who, it wasn't the fact that I don't think it was so important what body went around another body. It was the fact of being told that the church was wrong, right? Which was the sort of key factor in impeding recognition of Galileo's claim. So here's another example of misinformation from the U.S. government. This is a 1943 USDA food guide. And if you look in the upper left there, you'll see that one of the food groups is butter and fortified margarine. That's a food group, right? It's the U.S. government telling everybody who was around in 1943 that they ought to make sure they have, plenty of butter and fortified margarine every day. This is classic. This is, again, we laugh now, but if you talked to nutritionists in 1943 and said, this is ridiculous, they would have been like, no, here's why you really need a lot of butter and fortified margarine, right? Again, it's with benefit of hindsight, it's easy to see. Another example, 1946, advertisement, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. I heard some laughs. You won't laugh in a few minutes when I tell you what's going on now. So, misinformation, right? In theory, in theory, the government is supposed to sort of protect against truth in advertising, but, that didn't happen here. A classic photograph, right? This is, one of the most famous photographs. So what was this one showing? This is, anyone want to give us, what's the story behind this photograph? Who is this showing? Yeah, and so the Chicago Daily Tribune, this is, famously, because when you call elections, right? We've all seen when elections happen. When you call elections, it's a statistical exercise, right? You don't actually have all the votes. When the networks say, okay, we're going to call this state for this candidate or whatever, and there's always it's a tension, right? Because on the one hand, you don't want to be the last network to figure out that, such and so, this presidential candidate won the majority of the votes in this state. So you want to be early. On the other hand, the earlier you make that call, the higher the risk is that you're going to end up, statistically having made the wrong decision. And in a classic example of this, this newspaper made a call and they made the wrong call. And of course, you see then a triumphant, President Truman holding the newspaper that made the call. And so in this case, the experts, in quotes, the statisticians at whoever was giving the Chicago Daily Tribune this information, they were overly aggressive, and that obviously backfired. Now this is amusing, but I'll give you a more tragic case of several more tragic cases of misinformation So does anyone here know what the American Psychiatric Association famously did with the DSM in the mid 20th century? Yeah, characterized being gay. I mean, it is untold damage was done by this, just unimaginable damage. And so and these are the top. These are people, sometimes with respect to misinformation, people say, well, we talked to the experts. These were the experts, right? These were the top psychiatrists in the United States. And in their considered terrible judgment, that being gay was a sociopathic personality disturbance, right? And this led, as I think probably all of us know, to a purge of people who were gay working for the government, right? That being outed as being gay was enough to end somebody's career, end their ability to earn a living, right? And that action was backed by this august body of people. I mean, I doubt whether anybody in this room has, psychiatric formal training in psychiatry, but these were the quote experts. And then 1968, they slightly modified it. It was being gay was categorized as a sexual deviation. And it wasn't until 1973 that they voted to remove this. And, today we understand that being gay is just a normal part of human variation, right? There's nothing pathological about it at all. But and it's, we know that today, but this was, I illustrate this because this is to me, one of the most tragic examples of saying, well, just because people are experts, in quotes, doesn't necessarily mean that they're right on this stuff. So this disinformation got resolved, but it took decades, and untold suffering happened as a result of it. Another tragic example. I'm old enough to remember, the students may not be, but when the Iraq War started, and so what happened is Secretary of State Colin Powell, a distinguished statesman, but who to the end of his life regretted this. What he did is he went to the United Nations, and he was the Bush administration was making the case to go into Iraq on the purported grounds that Saddam Hussein was engaged in making weapons of mass destruction. Okay, so Colin Powell goes to the United Nations, and this is a quote, he presents satellite photographs and he describes, quote, irrefutable and undeniable evidence of Baghdad's attempt to basically develop weapons of mass destruction. And then he says this couldn't be more confident. My colleagues, every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence. This has gravitas, right? This is the confidence of the full weight of the U.S. government behind this assertion. And this is from the New York Times, right? So then we have, the newspaper of record, the New York Times, endorsing this, right, as fact, right? And how many people died in the Iraq War? A lot, right? Thousands of Americans, tens of thousands or perhaps more Iraqis, in significant part tied to this disinformation. Again, with the perspective of time, we know that this was false, but that does very little for the thousands of people who were killed as a result of this. So disinformation, wasn't disinformation, it was misinformation. Misinformation can be really harmful. So let's go to more recent, COVID is an example. Let's take a moment to read this tweet from the World Health Organization from January 2020. Preliminary investigations conducted by the Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission of COVID. How well has that stood the test of time? Not very well, right? So here you have the World Health Organization, tweeting something that, was provably false. Someone very charitable might argue that the authorities really didn't know, but I think it's a hard argument to sustain. Is the assertion that COVID came from a lab misinformation? And I should say, I have no idea. I do not claim to know where COVID originated. I have no position on that. I'm just saying, is this misinformation that should be, and I'm not asking you to take a position either, but is this misinformation that should be blocked by social media companies? Should it? Do social media companies allow you to make the assertion that it came from a lab? The answer is it depends. So in February 2021, Meta's policy was you weren't allowed to assert that COVID came from a lab because that was deemed to be misinformation, and they would take it down if you made that assertion. And yet, a few months later, they said, on the other hand, it's okay to make that assertion, right? So something that was classified as misinformation in February of 2021 was no longer classified as misinformation in May of 2021. Did the facts on the ground change? The probability that COVID did or didn't come up from a lab? I don't know that that there was any more confidence one way or the other on that point. It was a policy decision by people at Facebook or at Meta, right? Another question. Here's a statement. I'm going to make the statement. I'm going to ask you if it's misinformation. If you test positive for COVID and are asymptomatic, it's fine to return to work 7 days later. Is that statement misinformation or is that accurate? Any thoughts? Did you say it's misinformation? Well, you're partially right and you're partially not right. And the answer to that question just depends when. In July 2020, it would have been misinformation. You had to wait 10 days. But in December 2021, you only had to wait 5 days, right? What changed? Well, I mean, you can go into all sorts of reasons about why that changed. Maybe the science changed. Maybe there was pressure from industry groups wanting people back to work earlier. But the point is that this statement alone, we have the luxury today of sort of looking back at this stuff and saying, well, it's sort of, it doesn't make sense for it to be misinformation one month and not misinformation the next month unless something changed. But the challenge that social media companies, and I'm really focusing on social media companies because that's where a lot of the information travels fastest. The challenge that social media companies have is they don't have the ability to say, hey, let's go take a time machine and let's travel forward a few decades and see kind of what the answer is. And then let's go back and decide how we're going to label this stuff, right? They don't have that challenge. They have to make these decisions on the fly. And historically, we haven't been very good at it. And the final thing I'll mention is, this is something that's going on right now. This is a headline you can see from March of 2023. So one of the things that's going on right now is the FDA is trying to figure out what are the rules. You go to the grocery store and you see some packaged food and it'll say the word healthy on it, right? And what are the rules that have to be satisfied in order for a food to be called healthy on the label, healthy? And there's a big fight. And previously, there have been limits on saturated fat, but not on added sugars. So you could have as much added sugar as you want. You could still call it healthy. But the FDA has proposed changing that. They've proposed putting a limit beyond which, if there's more than this amount of sugar, you can't call it healthy. So what do you think the food industry is doing? Do you think they like this? Probably not. And so this is from an article last month, the Consumer Brands Association, that represents 1,700 major food companies, they wrote a 54-page comment. Now I'm going to quote the highlighted portion on the bottom. We believe, however, that FDA's restrictive approach to added sugar content in food described as healthy is unwarranted and outside the FDA's authority, given the lack of scientific consensus on the relationship between sugar intake and diet-related disease. In March 2020, or 2023, I'm not sure when they submitted the comment, but in recent months, they are actually asserting that there is a lack of scientific consensus on the relationship between sugar intake and diet-related disease. I mean, that is, that's evocative of the claims that the tobacco industry was making in the 1960s and 1970s, saying there's really no proof that there's a correlation between smoking and health consequences. I mean, of course there's proof, right? And it's really hard with a straight face to make this claim now. So I guess my point is that, and this is, by the way, this is the third example. Remember I talked about vested interests being a source of misinformation? I mean, I really have a hard time believing, maybe it's true, but it would surprise me if the people who wrote this actually believe that, there's no correlation, between sugar and diet-related disease. In fact, when you travel, I don't know, I travel, when I'm in Mexico sometimes, if you buy food and it has more than more than a certain amount of sugar, it actually says a label Like in Mexico, they have a rule. It says you have to have, it says excess sugar if the thing has more than, more than a certain amount of sugar, but not here. And here the fight isn't over whether it's going to say excess sugar. Here the fight's over whether you can put healthy on something that has excess sugar. I mean, that's pretty insane. And so the reason I mention is that, again, is not that we're going to have a big sidebar on sugar, added sugar, but that when we don't have the luxury of perspective of time, these issues become a lot more complicated, right? And so it is easy to sort of say high-level stuff about the importance of combating misinformation and disinformation, all that kind of stuff, but it's a lot harder to do it in real time when there are all these complicated forces, pushing people to have one view or another. And then two more slides before we get to a little sort of breakout. The government and misinformation, we have obviously the First Amendment here, and thanks to that, we would, misinformation is, with a few exceptions, a few categorical exceptions, misinformation, the exceptions being like, food labeling. The government has to have a very limited role, right, in addressing misinformation. The government can have a role in things like food ingredients, right? If a company is selling food and they lie about the ingredients, right? Well, the government has a role in addressing that. Fraud, right? If somebody is committing fraud, right? And selling financial products that are actually fraudulent and making claims about them that aren't true, the government has a role in that sort of thing. But in most types of misinformation, also truth in advertising, right? If somebody's selling an automobile and says it's a gasoline-powered automobile and it gets 500 miles to the gallon, well, again, the government can say, well, no, you're not allowed to tell people that. But for the vast majority of misinformation falling outside categories like this, the First Amendment prevents the government, and rightly so, from taking action. And if you doubt that for a second, you will probably not doubt it if I remind you that if the government did have a role in deciding what was true and not true, imagine how that would look if the politician you like least was in charge of making that decision. Were in charge of making the decision about what was true and what was not true, and could enforce that, for example, on social media companies. That would be a problem. And so that's why we should be glad that the First Amendment prevents the government from doing that. What the result of that, however, is that to the extent online misinformation and disinformation is going to be addressed, the key actors are going to be, in large part, the largest social media companies, because they're obviously private entities, and they have First Amendment rights with respect to the content and the speakers they host. Asterisk on that, because as some of you may know, there are some, Texas and Florida have passed some laws. There's some litigation going on. It's almost certainly going to end up in the Supreme Court in the next term about, there's some people who argue that social media companies should be, the government can compel social media companies to carry certain speakers and content, but that hasn't happened yet. So we're going to work on the assumption here that the social media companies can decline to host content and speakers that they don't want to host as private entities. So the bottom line is the responsibility to address the information ecosystem from this standpoint is going to be on private companies, and most notably the largest social media companies, just because they have such an enormous impact on information out there. So one more slide, and then we're going to get to our sort of group discussion framing. Some key takeaways here is that, it's good to have some humility, I think. Assessing truth can be really hard, especially on short time scales. Uncertainty is a really big barrier to sort of definitively deciding whether a statement is true or not. And there's some cases where it's easy to know right away that things are misinformation, but there's an awful lot of cases, as we've seen examples, where people just didn't get it right. Historically, we have not been very good at it, right? There's the amusing example, like the Dewey defeats Truman. There's the tragic example, like classifying being gay as a pathology. And we are better. We know better on issues like that, but it would be a very naive assumption to assume that right now, uniquely in all of our history, we have the right answers to all the right answers to these complex questions, right? If we were wrong 20 years ago and 30 years ago and 80 years ago and 200 years ago about a bunch of other things, we're probably wrong about some things now, right? There's probably some things that we're wrong about. We shouldn't assume that we've perfected assessing truth today. And I think that frameworks for addressing misinformation should recognize uncertainty. I think, this idea that you just going to get a committee of experts in a room and that puts, that ends it is, history shows that that's not necessarily a good solution. So on that note, here's the scenario to think about. And, what I hope I've done is sort of, provided some context that can help provide a more nuanced way to think about these things. But the scenario is, let's suppose that at your table, I think that's the easiest way to do breakout groups because nobody has to move because we got tables with about the right number of people. Suppose that you, all 4 or 5 or 6 of you, or whatever the number is, that are at your table, are all employees at a major social media company, one of the big social media companies, and that you're in charge of approaches for addressing misinformation in content that your company is hosting. How would you do that in a way that recognizes the role of uncertainty as well as recognizes the harms done on not taking down misinformation that could be doing harm? Like, we used the example of the hypothetical tweets about cholera, one of them being misinformation that could harm people if people in 1855 had believed that. And a couple of other things to keep in mind, that if you are at a major social media company, you don't possibly have the ability to have any human being check every post that goes up, right? If you look at Twitter alone, I don't know the recent numbers, but I think there's something like 5 or 6 or 7,000 tweets per second. At least there were when I last looked, right? So Twitter couldn't possibly hire enough humans to sort of screen all that. YouTube, I think I may be misquoting this, but I think a statistic I heard was, several hundred hours of video gets posted every minute on YouTube, right? So it's and Facebook, all these platforms, as you know, Facebook has, I think, over 3 billion users in the world. I can't even imagine how much content is being posted. So you need to have some kind of automation as part of this process. But, and as you consider this, how might you specifically look at assertions that are not verifiable immediately, but will be verifiable in days, right? And you might think of, claims about elections like that. And also, how might you think about assertions that may be true, but that run counter to widely accepted views? Again, I'll give the hypothetical there. If I had come to University of Buffalo in 1953, or my own university, UCLA, and stood at a podium like this and argued that the American Psychiatry Association is wrong. And not only that, but I think people who are engaged have the same rights as marriage and employment and housing as anybody else. Then, the administrators of the school would have said, I'm sorry, we didn't know he was going to say that. And they would have issued an apology, and the students would have been really unhappy. And, maybe the school president would have issued a statement saying, John showed up and he said something that doesn't represent our institutional values, right? That would have been a really radical thing to say, right? But today, of course, we know that is, we understand that is the right way to look at things. So the point is that some of what we may label as misinformation today may turn out to be a widely accepted view in the future. So my charge to you is, can you think of a concrete set of strategies for addressing misinformation informed by this framing, and do it in 10 minutes? And what we're going to do is we're going to take 10 minutes, and then we're going to ask each group to sort of have one person, a spokesperson from that group, tell us in 1 minute sort of some takeaways. Does that make sense? Is that all right? All right, so let's start our 10-minute thing. It's 11:25.
Then the other was like, not immediately, but the tweets which were flagged as disinformation or misinformation, we can appoint human annotators for them later on, just to verify whether it was actually wrong or correct, because that way we are not putting human effort in all the tweets, but at least the tweets which were highlighted as wrong. And then later on, it was discussed that we should actually educate people to not rely on social media for the truth, and we should actually the thing should be like, we should educate them that social media is not the right way to go about it, because this nothing can be true in the actual sense. Like, we cannot actually tell that this is a truth in the correct.
Okay, interesting points. Although I guess I would, interesting question. One reaction is, you wouldn't want to go too far with that. For example, if the National Weather Service Buffalo tweets there's a severe thunderstorm, heading your way, we want people to believe that. We don't want people to be like, who says the National Weather Service knows where the thunderstorms are, right? So, but yeah, it's really interesting. Okay, let's maybe in the back here.
Okay, so for the first one, we would do some sort of like label or scale that it's not had yet been verified, and then gets a stamp that it's been verified or something. And then for the second one, we had quite a lively discussion and a bunch of different examples, but at the end, we had to live with uncertainty, and there was nothing really we could do other than a disclaimer.
Okay.
Live with uncertainty.
Okay, fair point. How about the table right in the front here? I don't know anyone's name, but
I think there is a lot of information that you perhaps won't be able to label, but at least look at the low-hanging fruit. For example, there are some sources could be paid actors or could be intentional in spreading that at that point is going to be disinformation, right? But sort of go back to history of what they say and mark them as unreliable sources, and then people who sort of re-forward their information might also be labeled as sort of collaborating and spreading misinformation. So in some way, this is taking history into account when you already understand if they're consistently doing this kind of problematic sort of information spreading or not. And also we talked about some sort of places colluding, so identifying clicks or perhaps conflict of interest, like in the case of food industry, where they're sort of saying questionable things because they there's business interest, right? Conflict of interest identifying, or perhaps even if this is scientific debate, you can label people as experts so they wouldn't be questioned as much, right? Or different labels like conflict of interest or sources that are unreliable. So different kinds of label in some way to take in history into account.
so more labeling. Okay, that's okay. How about in the back table? Yeah.
Okay, so we decided that we two lines of inquiry. One, we decided that the editorial policy of a social media network is dependent upon what the purpose of a social media platform is for. Is it to disseminate truth, or is it to disseminate a particular point of view? And we couldn't decide on that, but we did agree that the combination of technology in a market society yields a set of pretty bad incentives for the platforms. Secondly, we thought that no matter what the nature of a platform should be, that slowing things down might help, and so that would probably involve increasing the cost of the enterprise of posting on social media. So,
Okay, thank you. How about the table here? Yeah.
All right, so we also suggested some visual cues or labeling, but that doesn't necessarily stamp as true or false, but reminds people that they're in an area of epistemic uncertainty. We also thought that a newsfeed algorithm that people can opt into that intentionally offers counterpoint, point counterpoint might be useful. And then also maybe changing an algorithm so that it is more likely to promote content that has its support as part of the tweet thread. So, supporting citations and links and data, and especially if the support comes from varied sources rather than crappy sources. So anything you should share?
Okay, thank you. And then maybe the table between us here.
Okay, so we discussed that we can decide we won't ban tweets or we won't take the tweets down, but as the content moderator, what we can do is we can we can put a red dot on the tweets and we can say that this is a topic which is currently debatable, because at this moment we don't know if this is right or wrong, and we're just seeing how this unfolds. So that could be one approach. And also that some topics are of a more serious and direct consequence to the public, like health. So those topics need to be monitored more than
let's say something which is not of a direct consequence to the public. So we can just add visual cues and let the public decide that this is still under debate.
Thank you. And then the last table.
So our really the end is we want to have an artificial intelligence that's like created by a population of experts from all different fields. And so this artificial intelligence will search the public opinion to approve posts. And those posts that are approved will like we want to have like the names of all the sources listed on them, to say when it was approved. And with this, we want sort of like an expiration date, because as like the truth changes and everything changes, eventually after like a week or so, it'll have to be verified again just to make sure it's up with the proper standard. With this, we want to also seek a way to eliminate bias of the social people, and also we want disclaimers on the minority opinion just to make sure that their voices are still known, but people aren't misinformed in the way that they think this is the full truth. And also, artificial intelligence will never be perfectly certain. So when artificial can't determine what is true and what is false, it would be sent to like a group of humans who can actually give the final say.
Okay, well, thank you very much to everyone's, also just to echo in the point of the potential harms, right? If I go on social media and assert that I can run a 100-meter dash in 10 seconds, that's false. That's really false, but it's also not that harmful. Maybe it just means I'm deluded, but it's not harm. But on the other hand, if there's a health related thing, well, then that matters. Okay, so I want to be respectful of our time. We've got 2 respondents here. So I don't know if you come up here or do you speak, how does it work? Okay, so
Hello.
yeah, there you go.
Hello. All right, cool. All right. I guess I'll just play devil's advocate for a second. This is an important topic, so try to generate some discussion about it. The idea that we're discussing is like self-regulation of companies, which I don't really feel like is a very plausible idea. If we look at Microsoft, for example, a few months ago, they laid off their AI ethics committee. Twitter, if the press reaches out to them, they respond with a poop emoji. That's not a joke. I wish it was. Facebook's efforts have been symbolic at best. Places like Discord, Reddit, Telegram, they really have no safeguards in place that I know of. So trying to attack it from that point of view seems to me maybe flawed to begin with. I think these companies, they don't operate in sort of a moral landscape. What they care about is quarterly stock prices. If they can get their quarterly stock prices higher, they can issue shares at a higher rate. They can generate more money, and everyone at the top gets big bonuses, and everyone's happy. Google recently said, we're going to keep building AI, and we're going to pass the buck to Congress. We're not going to do anything about the ethics of it. That's kind of up to you. So looking at Congress, Dr. Villasenor actually has testified in front of Congress multiple times. I read some of your testimonies, and you brought up, for example, a law that you perceived as trying to protect consumer privacy in the digital world, and the technology changed so quickly that this law was actually hurting privacy of the consumers. AI and stuff like that is changing even more rapidly, and frankly, I think Congress is completely inept at legislating something like that. They, even if they were, they would have to do it, as you pointed out in your testimony, they would have to do it with soft legislation, or they would have to change their laws so quickly, it just doesn't seem feasible at the pace that Congress works at. Yeah, I guess that's pretty much it for me. I really hope someone can prove me wrong. I really hope someone can tell me that I'm wrong. I would love that. So I guess I'll just pass it off to you.
And can I just very briefly respond to that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's a very important, interesting discussion to be had about the role of regulation with respect to technology generally. But what I'm focusing on here is who decides what truth is. Who's in charge of deciding truth? And people are free to disagree, but I would find it very concerning if the government was in charge of deciding truth. In addition to the First Amendment concerns that would raise, other than in very narrow domains like, financial fraud, food labels, things like that. Anyway, so.
Sure. So a couple of thoughts on technology today. First of all, underline all this, machines. Machines themselves aren't accurate, they aren't objective, they aren't unbiased. It all comes down to the programming that goes into them and the data, we'll use that word loosely, the training set on which these programs are trained. These programs tend not to have any gradation of veracity or error or certainty built inside them. It is possible to do so, but stuff that's out there doesn't. I'd like to tell a story. 2002, I can remember talking to a SUNY lawyer at the time. At that time, you'd go on Mosaic. Everybody here knows Mosaic, don't you? It's like pre-Google. And you would ask a question and you'd get 1,000 hits or 2,000 hits. That's the order of magnitude difference in the last 2 decades. And you could spend 3 days going through those 1,000 hits to verify whether or not what was coming back at you was true or false or garbage or maybe had an element of truth in it. 20 years earlier, when I was in school, you'd go to the library and spend those 3 days. You'd find 2 books, which absolutely knew you could trust them. There's a skill set there that we haven't taught, right? How do we today verify what comes at us? So there are implications for technology. The skill set of bird dogging problems. There's an art of bird dogging. Bird dogging is when you send the dogs out, you're hunting. You send the dogs out, they scare up the birds who go flying off, and then you can shoot them, right? We need to develop the art of bird dogging technology problems. How do we think about what's liable to happen, unintended consequences? How do we put ourselves in a position of asking what's the implication of technology in ways that we haven't thought about, but are possible? Sort of ask the impossible. The tech motto, go fast and break stuff. It breaks stuff. And one of the consequences, one of the things that gets broken is us and society. And we need to rethink that motto a little bit in light of demonstrable harms of AI over the last 2 decades.
Really, really great points. Just one quick thing is that, another example, I agree, looking at data. I mean, sometimes it can take a long time. Another example that comes to mind is climate change. I mean, you'd have to be really delusional today to deny that climate change is a problem. But in the 1980s, you could find, you could legitimately argue with data either side of the assertion that, climate change is a big problem. Today, I don't think you can credibly argue anything but agreeing that climate change is a problem. So that sometimes the data can take years before it kind of clarifies things. I wanted to just give a chance. We have a few more minutes, and I'm sure we have a super capable, creative, interesting group of people here. And any questions, comments, thoughts from anybody on any of this stuff? This is hard. These are hard problems, and I can't agree more with what you said. That I think we need to train, especially our young people, to sort of, be able to engage with this fire hose of information and process it and discern, to engage with it. It's really hard. Yes, somebody in the back. David.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. This is so wonderful. I mean, we were just talking about how it is very clear you're a great pedagogue. You got us all talking, and we didn't want to shut up.
That's because you're hungry, and you knew that if you did this, then you could do it.
In any case, I wanted to make a comment and ask for your reaction. This is to your point about the role of vested interest in this space. A few months now ago, I was approached by a journalist who represents or represented the Iranian TV, and they wanted to ask me a few questions about a couple of books that I worked on with a partner that dealt with the problems with the current media and information environment. And one of the questions really speaks to what you were saying earlier about vested interest and the trap that comes with it. So the interviewer asked me what I took to be a very leading question. He wanted me to comment on Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter and the danger of allowing corporate moguls to own our information environment. Now, as I wrestled with a way to frame that question, I wanted to avoid what would be the default position, which is in my zeal to potentially agree with the interviewer about the dangers of allowing our corporate powers to take over our information environment. I wanted to make sure that I was not defending a government takeover of information. So I had to be very careful to balance my response, but at the same time, I was very conscious of the fact that on its face, the leading question he was asking had a very straight answer: no. At the same time, it's an answer that needed to be qualified because of what you said. You know, a government takeover of information would not be the solution either. The result of this is that the interview was not aired on Iranian TV.
Well, yeah, one can be simultaneously concerned about the concentration of immense power in a few private companies over the information ecosystem. One can hold that concern and also be horrified by the idea of a government monopoly on the information ecosystem, which is what you, of course, have in authoritarian countries. And again, there's lots to worry about in this country, but that is not one of the things we need to worry about, thanks to the constitutional protections that we have. But yeah, it's authoritarian countries that maintain strangleholds over their own information environment love to come to the United States and sort of, say, look what a mess it is over here, and use that to justify their approaches, which we don't agree with here. If you believe in the First Amendment, it's a really interesting observation. Other time for another question or observation or two? Yes, sir. We got somebody here. You want to wait for the microphone?
Thanks. Hi. Yeah, thanks for the talk. I really appreciate a lot of the points you all raised, and it's something that I've been thinking about too. In my head, as you mentioned, relying on corporations to self-regulate has several issues. Also does having government say what is and what isn't true. In my head, a lot of this could be solved if users had more of a say or more motivation to parse misinformation for themselves. If people were really concerned about misinformation, then maybe we would see more incentives for social media companies to regulate themselves better, because otherwise their user numbers would go down. However, we've just seen user numbers go up and up despite increasing headlines about misinformation in all of these studies. So I just was wondering, what's your take on the responsibility of the user or the average person in this day and age?
Yeah, it's a great question, but I'm going to respectfully push back by saying that even when we are highly motivated, it can be really hard. I mean, we all remember COVID. I mean, I don't know if you remember thinking about, I remember thinking, do I need to wipe down my groceries? Remember there was a whole time when they were like, you got to get, what now we know it probably does nothing at all, right? But there was a time where I wasn't sure. And there's any number of questions that all of us asked during COVID. Is the risk benefit trade-off worth it to go to the grocery store and send your kids to school to, and so given, it's hard to think of a motivation that prevents you from being physically in the same space with other people is a pretty strong motivation. And even when we had that motivation, the motivation to socialize, because we are social creatures, it was still really hard, I think, to figure out. And I think it's because there was so much conflicting information, right? So it's, I'd like to think that it's just getting people motivated. And the other thing I'd say is that there's so much information that we're inundated with, right? I mean, you might be motivated to figure out, one issue, but what about the other 60 issues that you got to get an answer on? You just wouldn't have time to, so it's hard. I don't have a good answer. I think it's a really good observation, but I don't have a good answer. Yes, we have a question. Which is what? Yeah.
Government. And but I think we can all agree that we don't want government telling us what the truth is. But I think there is a very big role for government in some sort of campaign about the issues of misinformation and supporting training efforts to help people develop the skill set that they need to deal with information.
I think that's a really interesting comment. Another area where you might think of a government role is transparency, right? In other words, the government certainly can't be in the business of telling people, generally speaking, being the absolute arbiter of truth, but you could have a discussion about what the rules might or might not be about transparency, imposing transparency requirements to some extent. So yeah, and I'm sure, in any group this large, if we start sort of talking about what is the right role and size of government intervention, these kind of things, I'm sure we're going to be all over the map, because I'm sure we have a diversity of views in this room, and I think that's a good thing. But it's certainly a reasonable thing to put on the table and discuss. I think it's a really, really good point. We have one more question. Yeah.
Oh, great. I get to be the last one. I guess this pertains to thinking specifically about disinformation, or where disinformation becomes, where or when disinformation becomes misinformation. But it occurs to me, and I've been sort of thinking, especially around that last point, the question of truth, actually, that we are discussing the power of narrative. That sort of came up in our panel, and it's come up a couple of times here, right? And so that then, rather than ask, or perhaps in addition to asking, or rather than asking what is true or what is false, I think it's important to also ask what story is being told and who benefits from that story and who is harmed or potentially harmed.
No, that's a really good point. And I know, more broadly, it's a little off topic, but I always like to think, what are the things that we're doing today that 100 years from now, people are going to be horrified by the fact that we did them. I mean, one example I can think of is the supply chain for our electronics and the clothes we're wearing and things like that. And most of us are sort of blithely unaware of the probably horrific abuses that are involved in that supply. I mean, and that sort of ties to some of these thinking. So anyway, it's been wonderful to engage with all of you. I look forward to conversations over lunch, and I know that I'm standing between you and lunch, so I should get off the stage. So.